Hi everyone, my name's Darryl Panes, CEO at As Good As Gold Australia, and today once again I'm joined by my brother Brian,
Thank you, Dan.
partner at As Good As Gold. And this morning we interviewed John Adams, Chief Economist at As Good As Gold Australia. Good morning, John.
Morning, John.
Good morning, Darryl and Brian. How are you today?
Cool.
Cool, and very well, John. And I say good morning to you. That's mainly because we're out of lockdown over here in Adelaide. Mind you, we have
Thank you very much.
Yes, we've come to grips with the fact that it's the new norm to wear masks in public places. We're told we're going to have to get used to that. But in your case, of course, you've been in lockdown for a long time and you've got another month at least ahead of you. So we really feel for New South Wales people at the moment, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
it's tough ask.
I didn't know what to do with myself outside of making phone calls and talking to our clients. After that 3 days, it was absolutely what do I do next?
Yeah. So our thoughts are with you guys for sure. We're going to get on to that in a moment, but what I'd like to do, that is lockdowns, but what I'd like to do first is just confirm and follow up on an announcement that Brian and myself made last week. And that was with reference to the fact that As Good As Gold Australia, of course, has opened up in the US and Canada. So we're open for business. And so right now, you can go to our website, www.asgoodasgoldoz.com.au, and click on the international link. This will take you over to the products that are available to ship within the United States of America and Canada. And what you'll find is that we've started by listing some of the most popular gold and silver products on the market. Now, when placing an order, you'll want to make sure that the prices are being quoted in your local currency. If the prices haven't already defaulted to your local currency, you can change this manually by going to the top right-hand corner of our website and selecting USD or CAD from the currency selected drop-down. Once your order has been confirmed, you'll receive an email with our USD and CAD bank account details. By hovering over the products, you can click Quick View to bring up the dialog, which will display the quantity discounts. If you click View Details, you can check the availability of products and further product information. All products ship directly from Las Vegas. So once your order's been dispatched, it should arrive within just a matter of a few days. Now, John, I believe you also have a special offer for our USA and Canadian-based viewers.
Thank you for that, Darryl. So basically, if anyone from North America would like to make a purchase of gold or silver bullion product from As Good As Gold Australia, and they'd like to receive a discount, all they have to do is enter the promo code ADAMS, so ADAMS, and we'll offer a discount, and hopefully we'll help people along the journey of protecting their wealth during one of the greatest money printing episodes in world history.
Thanks for that, John. We're very excited, as we mentioned going back a week ago, about this launch. Because we've got a lot of clients, or prospective clients, I should say, in the United States of America, and we'd like to reach out to all of you and provide an alternative opportunity. So really looking forward
Absolutely.
to the time ahead moving forward. John, I mentioned earlier lockdowns, and it's really interesting because at the beginning of 2021, you made a couple of very bold predictions, or certainly would have seemed so then, because a lot of people were saying that the lockdown would be a once only. And you suggested there and then that 2021 we would experience a lot more lockdowns, and that has in fact turned out to be exactly the case. You also talked about stagflation around the world and talked about how that would accelerate, resulting, of course, in Joe Biden's policies. And you're right again. So I want to talk a little bit about this. Lockdowns. For the past 4 weeks, you have been living in lockdown in a red zone in New South Wales. I mean, this is causing havoc to business, people's lives, and everyone's suffering in the process. Can you talk about what the lockdown means from both a political and civil rights perspective, but also, and this is really important, an economic perspective? Especially as we start to see protests taking place all around the world. They're gaining momentum. France, Italy, Greece, England, here in Australia. Your take on this, John?
I mean, you are correct. So I am in the red zone here in New South Wales in Australia. I've been in lockdown for 4 weeks, and only in the last 24 hours has the state government of New South Wales said that we're going to be in lockdown for another 4 weeks, going through to the end of August. Now, only today, so we're recording, so we're about 11:30 in the morning here in Sydney. Only half an hour ago, the new case numbers were released and they have gone up again. So the Premier has announced even further restrictions today relative to yesterday. I mean, it is a huge problem in terms of what this means going forward. So we have had protests around the world. We had some protests in Sydney and Melbourne in particular last week. I mean, on the political and civil rights issue, I think there's a couple of important points to call out. The first one is that I think there is a concern that the public health risk is lower than what we're being told, and that these lockdown measures are disproportionate to the risk, and that they are potentially unnecessary compared to other potential approaches, i.e. Sweden. So there is a lot of people who are very concerned that we are witnessing in the Western world not just a temporary disruption to civil rights, but we're seeing something more permanent. I did an interview with another YouTube channel earlier this morning, and one of the things we talked about was states of emergency. So in Australia, whether it's where you are in South Australia or New South Wales, I mean, the government can have a state of emergency. Typically, states of emergency are for short, sharp periods where there is an emergency, whether it's a natural disaster like a flood or a bushfire or something of that description. And during the states of emergency, the senior bureaucrats are given enormous legal powers to do a number of things in order to help the state to get through that particular emergency. The problem we have with COVID-19 is the so-called emergency has been happening for 18 months and there is no end in sight. And even in Queensland, they've just passed in the last few months legislation taking the state of emergency through to 2022. So we are seeing the Australian way of life, which is the same as like most of the Western world countries around, liberal democratic rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to make your own medical decisions. Some of these things are being eroded and in quite dramatic fashion. I've been particularly shocked here in New South Wales as to how quickly our free society has just collapsed, and now we are just accepting all of these restrictions, and there's no real pushback around it. So I think there is a concern that we're not going to go back to how we were living in 2019, and this could be a more permanent feature. So I think that's a very concerning trend, and that's why I think we're seeing major protests all over Europe, whether it's, like I said, Italy, France, Greece, London, etc. There are people across the world, in the Western world, in Europe, in North America, here in Australia, who will not accept a totalitarian surveillance state. I think there are some red lines that politicians and bureaucrats in the media have crossed. And I think that these issues have been bubbling under the surface for a while. I think they've come to fruition now, and that is going to cause a huge disruptive effect going forward. And then obviously on the economic impact, now Australia is relatively different, and New South Wales is in particular different compared to other parts of the country, but also around the world. We have the biggest household debt bubble in Australian history. The bulk of the debt is actually being held by people in Sydney. House prices, real estate prices are at record levels. Before the lockdown, financial stress, as in mortgage stress and rental stress, were at all-time highs. And then you put all that on top of a lockdown. And what that means is that if you are not financially prepared from a cash flow basis in terms of debt management, in terms of having sufficient savings to get through a tough time, there are millions of people in Greater Sydney who have been suffering, even though it's just 4 weeks. And as we go forward for this next 4 weeks, the screw is going to be turned on even more. One of the problems in the first 4 weeks of this lockdown has been is that the financial support from the government has been delayed. So, for example, business support has only, applications for business support from the New South Wales government was only offered starting on the 19th of July. And then when you look at how much support has been given, well, in terms of individual support for people who have either lost hours or lost their jobs, the federal government's only been giving $600 a week. And when you think about how in debt people are, $600 a week is just not enough to cover the rent or cover the mortgage or cover food bills and all the other things are. And there are some banks who are not giving mortgage holidays like they were last year. And the level of financial support, like I said, is not as generous as it was last year. So I think one of the important messages, Darryl and Brian, is that one of the things I've tried to do through my website, with Martin North, with As Good as Gold Australia, is to help educate Australians about being financially prepared. And being financially prepared is obviously about holding sound money, gold and silver bullion. I mean, that's a big part of it. But it's also about a whole host of other financial considerations that people need to be aware of and actually make plans so that when things do go amiss, that you're not going to be in a financially destitute position. So because I've taken those precautions, I mean, I sailed through 2020 in fairly good shape in terms of me and my family. We did fine. And I would say that these lockdown procedures are more onerous on me now in 2021 compared to what I went through last year. And because I am prepared, because I am out of debt, because I have a lot of bullion, because I have got good cash flow management, because I have prepaid bills and stockpiled on like non-perishable goods in particular, we have sailed through the first 4 weeks in pretty good shape. And I think we're going to be okay as we go forward through August. But for millions of Australians, millions of people in Sydney who haven't been diligent like we have and who haven't been listening to the warning signs that we've been banging on for the last 3 years, their chickens are coming home to roost. And unfortunately, the pressure, both financial, social and psychological, is intensifying. And I think that's going to get worse as we go forward. And when you combine the loss of civil and political rights with enormous financial pressure, we did have some big protests last weekend. Dare I say, things could become more explosive in the next weeks and months.
You make enormous sense, John. Everything you've said is extremely valid. I just don't think a lot of people are really understanding how impacting this is going to be economically as it wears on. And we've even been told now by the Prime Minister that vaccination isn't going to really resolve the problem of lockdowns. They're going to continue. It's not the sole answer to this. And, I look at this, John, and I believe at the moment it's costing New South Wales about $1 billion a week. That's with a B, not an M. $1 billion a week. These lockdowns. You think of a construction worker, and people. It's $500 million a week that it's costing to have them in lockdown. And you look at it and you think there are something like 300,000 tradies out there that aren't going and buying a coffee in the morning. aren't buying lunch. It's either cafes, the restaurants,
the service industries.
The service industries, they all fail in the process. Closing of borders, what people don't understand here, it's a simple little illustration, but we had a shipment of silver just forwarded over a week ago, a couple of tonne of silver. And the transporters were held up, of course. They had to go through the process of being tested as well. And you think that was a 4.5 hour operation to do that. So it took 4.5 hours extra to do that. When they got back to Victoria, they probably would have had to have gone through the same process again. And you look at that, someone's got to pay for that, don't they?
It gets added into the price.
Of course it does. It gets added to the price. Someone has to pay. Look, lining up for COVID testing, lining up, takes everyone time. I hear of reports that it's taking 8-9 hours to line up. Now, I don't know what those people, obviously they're not employed at the time or they've taken time off, but we're not producing goods and services while we're waiting to be tested. Then you've got to go home and wait for a couple of days for the test reports to come through. I've never heard of anything so ridiculous in all my life.
No.
As a cost to this nation, it's out of sight. And people sort of think, well, okay, we can afford it. The government can always afford it. The government's broke. They haven't got any money. It's as simple as that. They haven't got any money. They are running a massive deficit at the moment, and it's intensifying by the minute. Our Prime Minister will tell you that we can't continue to do this. They haven't got the funds to do it. And we will never, because we'll never ever be able to repay the debt. What a lot of people don't understand, Brian, I've got to share this. You've got a factory. Let's say it was General Motors Holdings. And you've got a press. And let's say there's a press line. One press has a malfunction. We know what happens, don't we, Brian?
Fix the
whole production line. The whole press line stops. Now, there was only one operator on that press, but they had to stop the whole press line in the process. Millions of dollars an hour is the cost to that company. And Brian and I, from one press breaking down, Brian and I know one employee during our tenure within our engineering business, our manufacturing business, if one employee didn't turn up for work, we were scrambling.
We suffered.
Yeah. because that person's commitment and the product they were producing to a certain stage had then to be attended to by somebody else. So it all stopped. Where do you go from there? So you've got to start filling in people that are missing. It becomes a very difficult exercise. And I just want to quote this before we go, and then I'll finish my rant.
I'm sure you will.
But international business, Brian and I saw that there wasn't a big enough future in Australia for our product line. So initially, it was just in Adelaide. We had two major manufacturers here. We had Chrysler or Mitsubishi, as it was, and Holden's. Well, we wanted to expand beyond that, so we went interstate. We went interstate because Ford Motor Company and Toyota were there. And then we went to Queensland because the white goods industry, other industries operated and purchased our product. But then we wanted to develop even further, and so we went internationally. Now, today, we went to the US, we went to Canada, we went to Europe, we developed a business, we employed a lot more people. Having an international operation produced a lot more product. Today, you have difficulty travelling from one state to another because they're all locking down. And flying internationally, and you have to fly. You can't do it on a Zoom call. You've got to fly internationally to do business. And today, that's a very difficult exercise. You may not regain entry back into Australia. So we're confronted with all of these huge obstacles, and all of them mean one thing, John. Loss of production, producing goods that we sell internationally, and it just all stops. When that stops, there is only one result for this nation or any nation that is confronted with that, and that's bankruptcy. And that's where we're heading at the moment. So everything you said, John, everything that you said there so far as preparing for yourself is vitally important, because if one doesn't, they can't rely upon the government. Right? They've got to take control themselves right now.
Well, I don't know what to say now, Darryl.
Right.
Look, and the only very two quick comments I would make from what John has mentioned here is the fact that these things are being taken away from us, our privacy, of course, and things like that. But whenever I see a government taking away from you, it very rarely comes back. Two examples: taxation. They increase the tax. They never decrease the tax. It's always an increase, so it always goes further. The other one was 1971, the temporarily off the gold standard. It was temporarily, Mr. Nixon said. Right, well, that's 50 years ago, and that's a long time to wait temporarily. Let's move on. Okay. Another point that you've mentioned during this last month or so, John, is on the area of accelerated stagflation. You recently wrote about how the latest international data is showing that stagflation is accelerating around the world. Can you talk to what we are seeing and what are the immediate and medium-term implications for the global economy? Before you begin, I just want to make sure that people understand what stagflation is. So, John, description of stagflation, and then if you could answer my question.
Sure. So stagflation is a combination of weak economic growth, elevated levels of unemployment, underemployment, and rising prices. And according to the Keynesian textbook, that's not supposed to happen. So when you have a weak economy with high unemployment and a weak economic growth is supposed to be due to a lack of demand, and lack of demand should mean prices are falling, not rising. So the 1970s, when we went through stagflation, basically the Keynesians couldn't explain what was happening in the economy, and that was a particular phenomena where middle-class citizens around the world were basically being squeezed financially by not being able to produce enough income, and then obviously prices rising at the same time. So last year, when the lockdowns and the pandemic began, and March of last year, we saw this unprecedented amount of stimulus. I was out in Australia saying that stagflation had started here in Australia, and there was and this phenomenon would continue. And then at the beginning of the year, around February, I wrote an article, and I think we did a discussion here on this channel talking about accelerated stagflation, and I called out a number of the policies that Joe Biden had begun with around these unprecedented stimulus packages and closing down infrastructure projects, fracking, Keystone XL pipeline, and the US-Mexican border as job killing policies, as well as rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, and the combination of those elements would lead to stagflation going faster. And I just want to call out something that Darryl said, because I think that what Darryl said is sort of explains it pretty much in a nutshell. When a society produces less goods and services at the same time they are spending, at the same time that the government is spending more and more money and the central bank is printing more and more money, well, what's going to happen? Well, the less goods and services mean you have lower economic growth and you've got fewer jobs for people to be employed in, at the same time that the money printing is going to mean that those goods and services which have been produced are going to go up in price. And the combination of those two factors means that middle class people get squeezed in particular, and their standard of living goes down. And that's what we're seeing. So since February, when I talked about the risk of accelerated stagflation, we are starting to see inflationary data right across the world go up. If you look at, for example, the United States, their annual inflation rate is now at 5.4%. If you look at Canada, Canada is above 3%. The UK, South Korea, they've started to see rising consumer inflation above 2% and stay above 2%, whereas a number of these governments and central banks said, well, we don't want inflation to go above 2%. Well, in many of these economies, it's actually not just slightly above, it's above for quite a, it's above quite a bit, and it's been like that for several months. And even here in Australia, the inflation data has come out, and we are now seeing an elevated level of inflation among consumer prices. Now, when you look at, say, Germany or China, we are seeing the biggest amount of producer price inflation. So in terms of the supply chain, the biggest amount of inflation since the GFC. So perhaps the most inflation in a decade, and that process is also accelerating now. The narrative has been from Jerome Powell in particular is that this inflation is transitory, that this inflation was going to be short-lived and would be a result of economies returning back to normal because that the lockdowns would be ending. And so dare I say that, well, on one hand, well, the whole purpose is we're supposed to see a short burst of inflation because the lockdowns of 2020 were going to end and we're going to get back to normal, and then the inflation would sort of calm down. Well, here we are in 2021. The inflation is getting worse. Lockdowns in certain countries have returned. More stimulus is being produced in 2021 in terms of fiscal stimulus and as well as money printing. And that process is going to continue. So even in the last few hours, the Jerome Powell has talked about basically these emergency economic measures being more permanent, and they're not going to withdraw them. So while we get this official line from governments and central banks that inflation is going to calm down, if they continue to print, if they continue to spend, inflation is going to get worse. It's not going to actually improve. And the other point I will make is that in the context of this global debt bubble, which has just grown by the order of $25 trillion in the last 18 months, we can never go back to normal, because going back to normal in an economic policy sense means that inflation, the interest costs on debt will go up. People won't be able to pay those interest costs. That means that we'll have greater delinquencies on debt, greater defaults, and more systemic risk. And so now the governments and the central banks of the world have been adamant that the Harry Dent scenario of a deflationary depression is something that they think is that they can't contemplate. So in order to stop the debt bubble from imploding, they have to continue to print to keep the financial system in this bubble intact, and that's what they're doing. And the result of that is this stagflation process will get worse going forward, and the market and the and people around the world will realize that these promises of transitory inflation are bogus, and inflation will be a big problem in the years ahead.
Yeah, I picked up a number of points from what you mentioned there, and I certainly just add a few comments myself before we go on to the next question. We're referring to inflation, and the inflation figures I've just picked up in the last couple of weeks. That typical shipping containers out of China, they have risen 400% in the last 12 months. So what was a $2,500 shipping container cost is now well over $8,000, up to $12,000 for a shipping container. I have to make a point here. Also, worldwide increase in raw materials of copper, zinc, lead, iron ore, just going to the moon. The comment I was going to make, the points, without wage increases, the standard of living has to suffer. One solution is to unfortunately, this is the only one I can think of. One solution is to tighten up your expenditure and exchange any excess currency for precious metals, which always rises when governments increase the money supply. So when they print, so does gold and silver go up. A good percentage I have in my portfolio is 30%. So I will have assets in land, I will have assets in fine art, although I'm only just learning that at the moment, but the other third is in precious metals. And I would suggest that most people start to look at the overall averages of what they've got in their asset base.
Yep, agree. John, earlier this month, the Reserve Bank of Australia Board held its July board meeting, which laid out the future for monetary policy in Australia. Can you give a quick overview of the RBA's decision and policy and future policy guidance? And then, how does this guidance compare with other central banks?
In the lead up to the July meeting, there was a lot of speculation because there was a number of big decisions that the RBA had to make and sort of had to provide some guidance on. So there has been, and one thing I should say, Darryl, is that this July meeting was before the current lockdowns. And dare I say that the current lockdown in Sydney is going to change some of the language that the RBA is going to come forward with. But we had a number of the bank economists say that they would expect interest rates to start rising at the end of 2022 or early 2023. And that they could only raise interest rates to about 1.25%. So that was the chatter going in, and that was very different to what the RBA had said previously, which was that interest rates were not going to rise until 2024 at the earliest. So the RBA basically made a number of important decisions. The first one they did was they effectively ended yield curve control. So we had yield curve control last year on 3-year bonds. It started at 0.25%. Then in November last year, it was lowered to 0.1%. And this was they were targeting the April 2024 bond. So there was a lot of speculation as to whether they would extend that program to the November bond or not, and they decided not to. So now that for the 3-year bond rate is actually at a much more elevated level compared to 0.1%. So that's going to have some impact on funding costs for the banks. But on the other hand, they did say that they were extending quantitative easing through to November. Now, what they're doing now is buying $5 billion worth of bonds a week. They said they were going to reduce that to only $4 billion from September and take that through to November. And then they would reconsider what they do from there on in. But they did also say that they needed a number of preconditions to be met before they would even contemplate raising interest rates. And the first one is that quantitative easing would have to come to an end. The second one is that they would have to achieve full employment, which they said they thought was about 4%, and that they would need to see wages growth hit about 3% per annum, which would then result in the consumer price index growing consistently above 2% for several quarters. So they laid out a number of preconditions and said, well, unless if all these preconditions are met, we're going to not raise interest rates. And dare I say, now that we've gone through this lockdown period where governments are pouring more and more stimulus in, which will require more quantitative easing, any delay in interest rates are going to be put further on the back burner. And the reason why that's important is that obviously those in the deflation camp, like Harry Dent, have always said that the bubble will implode because once they start to tighten monetary policy, i.e. interest rates, people can't pay the interest costs. That's going to lead to default, and we're going to have a global financial crisis, something similar to 2008, but perhaps on a greater scale. But while they continue to print money, keep interest rates at record low levels, continue quantitative easing, they're going to try to continue perpetuating this debt bubble. And just like I said in my previous answer, continue this stagflationary process. Now, on the other hand, there have been some central banks around the world who have taken some early measures to normalize economic policy. So we've seen already in Russia and Brazil, they've started to increase their interest rates by a small fraction over the last few months. We also saw last month Reserve Bank of New Zealand say that they are going to bring quantitative easing to an end relatively soon. So there is some examples of normalization, whereas, like I said before in a previous answer, the United States basically have said, well, we're going to continue our policy stance going forward for quite a while. So Jerome Powell saying we're just going to continue to print and to continue to QE, and there is no prospect of stopping. And dare I say, with this further lockdown and all this additional spending by government, if anyone thinks that interest rates are going to go up anytime soon, I don't think that's going to happen. And anyone who thinks that we're going to see some sort of deflation, all the evidence I can see from what these politicians and central banks are saying and doing suggests to me that we're going to have more inflationary problems going forward, and we're going to see more money printing. And the other point I'll make is that I think mathematically we just can't raise interest rates to what they were before, because the debt is just so large that if we ever try to get interest rates to, even in Australia, if the official cash rate were at 0.1%, if we stopped QE and we took it to like 1.5% to 2.5%, the rise in mortgage rates would be large enough that a lot of mortgage holders just would not be able to pay their mortgage repayments, and it would bring the housing market and the banks into some sort of crisis point. And so the big problem with monetary policy, both around the world as well as in Australia, is we're effectively stuck. We're stuck in the most extreme settings in the history of economics, in the history of Australia, of the Australian economy, and we can't get out of it because the debt is so large. And the only outcome that I can see based on economic history is the initial accelerated stagflation, like we're seeing now, and at some point the currency is going to go bad, and we're going to see some form of hyperinflation. So on the basis of all the evidence I see, that's where the likely outcome is looking like. Now things can change, policies can change, politicians can change, circumstances can change, but it definitely looks like a more inflationary environment going forward, based on everything we can see today.
It's like the juggler, as I've always said, Brian. You can toss the juggler 8 balls and they can keep those in the air, and then a 9th one, and they can just manage that one, and then you throw the 10th one in there and they all come tumbling down.
And it all falls apart.
And that's really what I see is happening now. You've mentioned, John, about the inflation, and I sense that central banks know this. I think they fully understand where we're heading, which is why a lot of them have been adding to their gold reserves. Interestingly enough, the RBA or Australia hasn't been adding to their gold reserves, even though it seems the obvious thing to do to back your currency, because they'll need to, because it's going to be inflated to nothing. So at least gold, sound money, they've got a solid backing for their currency. Why are we not following suit in Australia?
Because we have a whole bunch of Keynesians at Martin Place in Sydney who don't actually understand what's going on. I mean, the thing is that the leadership of the RBA, the Governor Philip Lowe and his deputy Guy Debelle, they are just clueless. I mean, I've studied their work. I've listened to their public comments. I mean, these guys, all they know is left-wing Keynesian economics, and they don't understand the value of gold. I don't think they actually understand the nature of money. And I think that if you ask them, even privately, what do you think about these central banks around the world buying additional gold? I think they're going to say, well, we don't think that, we think that these other central banks have got rocks in the head. Why would you buy gold for? So, unfortunately, we've got tremendously poor leadership at the RBA. And like I completely agree with you, we should be increasing our gold reserves at the RBA. We should be recalling our gold reserves from the Bank of England back to Australia. We should potentially even be stockpiling silver as a reserve asset. And we definitely should be trying to protect the integrity of the Australian dollar because as we go forward, more and more people will start to question the value of not only of our currency, but currencies around the world. And when things turn bad, if people are not aware, just look at Lebanon now. In 2019, Lebanon, which is a relatively small country, had the third largest public sector debt relative to GDP in the world. In 2020, the finances of their debt, particularly from Europe, caught in their loans. The Lebanese couldn't pay back. The Lebanese pound has collapsed. And in Lebanon today, there is hyperinflation. And there are videos all over social media of people basically screaming and losing their mind in the street because they can't afford food, they can't afford medicine. And the bare essentials that we take for granted here in Australia, and perhaps some of our viewers in Canada and America, those basic essentials are not available in Lebanon, and people are really struggling. So, and again, those who struggle, even in hyperinflation, are those who are ill prepared for those circumstances. And so, and you do hear the comment from time to time, Lebanon is different to Australia. Australia, we're sort of we're an advanced country, we're a first world country. We're not going to suffer the sort of extreme conditions that Lebanon or Argentina has gone through. Well, dare I say, that's what the Germans were saying back in 1922, 1923. Germany was one of the leading countries in the world, particularly in continental Europe, advanced society in terms of engineering and culture and art and literature and music, etc. And they went through hyperinflation because they basically lost control of the currency. So, it doesn't matter if you're a third world country, second world country, first world country, if you don't manage your money properly or your currency properly, it will collapse in value. And that's something that we face in terms of risk here, but also in terms of our colleagues and friends over in America and Canada. And Lebanon is an example that people should pay attention to.
I've said it before, Australia produces, we're the second largest producer of gold in the world. We produce over 320 tonne per year, and we only have 80 tonne in Australia for the Reserve Bank of Australia. And that 80 tonne, by the way, is in London, not in Australia. How on earth these politicians think that printing currency is going to provide the needs of the future? I have no idea. My last question, John. Basically the subject is the Australian employment market. And I think for our US and Canadian people that watch and international people in general, the question is referring to everybody, but this one's on the subject of Australia. Given the RBA's commitment to reaching full employment, you decided to analyse the Australian labour market to understand what has happened during the pandemic and the severe border relations. Two questions. How has the combination of the pandemic and the economic stimulus impacted the Australian labour market as you see it?
I've just finished a very lengthy article, about 4,000 words, and it's published on my personal website, adamseconomics.com, and it's also published on the As Good as Gold website as well. So if people want to have a look at the detail, because there's a lot of statistical analysis I went through, and we don't have the time to go through it in chapter and verse here. So if people are interested, go and have a look at the article. But in essence, what's happened in Australia is a very fascinating situation. For 2 decades, we've had extremely high levels of immigration, and that immigration has been one of the reasons or one of the factors that has driven the household debt bubble and the construction sector, because we needed to build more houses because we've got more people coming into the country. So now, since the pandemic, our border policies are different to other countries. There are major limitations about who can come in and under what conditions, and there's also a lot of limitations as to who can leave Australia. And so for 18 months, we've had this unique circumstance of saying, well, now that we've got a lot less people coming in, and what I actually found in the immigration data is we've seen at least between 200 to 300,000 people in net terms leave the country in 18 months. Well, what has that actually meant for unemployment? Now, unemployment today in Australia sits at 4.9%. And you think to yourself, well, if you've gone through a pandemic, if you've got these lockdowns, if immigration has turned off the tap, how can unemployment be so low? Well, what's happened is that we've seen, so in the age category of 20 to 34 years old, we have seen more than 118,000 fewer people employed. But what we've seen instead is a whole bunch of middle-aged Australians, say between the ages of 35 to 44, as well as older Australians, 55 and plus, re-enter the labour market. So we've easily got about 100,000 Australians above the age of 55 back into the labour market working, a lot of them full-time. And we've also seen a lot of people between the ages of 35 to 44 also working full-time. They are also working. Now, what I will say is that the bulk of the jobs that have been created, they have been part-time. So while the over 55s are getting a lot of full-time work, the bulk of the jobs overall have been part-time. And a lot of the jobs that have been created have actually been in Queensland. So it's interesting here in my state of New South Wales, we've seen a shift of work from full-time to part-time. And we've seen particularly men, a lot fewer men being employed in New South Wales and unemployment among men going up. So there's a bit of a unique factor in New South Wales, but there's a lot of creation in Queensland, particularly on the Gold Coast. And dare I say, I think it has to do with construction. So we're seeing a lot of construction jobs. We've seen a lot of jobs around in terms of aged care, disability, healthcare, because there's been a number of jobs that have been required because of the pandemic, and a lot of these jobs have been funded by governments through this fiscal stimulus. And those who have stepped up to take those jobs are no longer immigrants, but Australians who were struggling to find work before the pandemic because of our high immigration numbers. So we've seen a complete recasting of the labour market, and what that means is that particularly going forward. So remember, the RBA said at the beginning of July that for interest rates to go up, we need to get to full employment. Full employment is 4% or below, and wages need to grow. Now, the data and the evidence that I've put together clearly shows that immigration has had a dampening impact about people to find work, and has actually created more competition in the labour market that has subdued wages growth. So if somehow we return back to normal and the border is sort of opened up again, and we have hundreds of thousands of people from around the world coming back into Australia to work, what that's going to mean is that it's going to be more harder to reach full employment. It's going to be more harder to get wages growth at 3%, and that's just going to provide a bigger roadblock for interest rates to go up. And what that would ultimately mean is that, again, we'll have more money printing by the RBA, and if you've got more people competing for the same sort of jobs, those who are struggling to find work, they're going to be squeezed even more financially, and their financial stress is going to be elevated in a post-pandemic world. So there's a lot of unique, interesting things that have happened to the Australian labour market during the last 18 months. And if people want to learn more, definitely feel free to read my analysis, or if they would like to email me and ask me some questions, feel free to, and happy to converse on the subject.
Thank you, John. Yeah, look, just an example of how it has affected As Good as Gold Australia, pandemics and stimuluses and everything else, and border controls. Actually, before I go on about As Good as Gold, this would be a very short answer. I mean, we ordered some curtains just recently, and it's a 12-week delivery. But what we notice As Good as Gold is that what used to take 2 to 3 weeks to have our product come from Melbourne to here, it had to be manufactured and then delivered to South Australia. What used to take 2 to 3 weeks, now 6 to 8 weeks. You know, because there's border controls, there's this, there's that, there's everything in place, not enough skilled labour, all this type of thing. So what you're saying is absolutely true.
I'm going to ask one simple, or bring up, not ask a question, but bring up a simple point. And that is, and I'm constantly asked the question, as are you, Brian, Why isn't gold soaring in this environment? Now, there's a reason it's not soaring. We've all heard, and we all know, that both gold and silver, precious metals, are manipulated. Why are they manipulated? Well, for a number of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons is that the price of gold and silver highlights the complete mismanagement of governments all around the world. So if the price of gold is high, it means the economy is travelling very poorly. If the price of gold is relatively low and we think undervalued, it's an indication that pretty much everyone out there is happy with the economy. So there are major forces at play that continue to manipulate these prices down. However, it's a little bit like the guy with the 9 balls and changing to the 10 balls, the juggler. At some point, you just can't manage it anymore. And this has been proven over and over again over hundreds and over thousands of years where governments have tried to do the same thing. And I mean, if we can go back to 1971, Brian, and they've been manipulating prices of precious metals since then. But gold has still performed. The gold it was $35 an ounce in 1971, and now it's
$2,500.
$2,500. So even though they've tried to suppress it, at some point it explodes. And we're getting pretty close to that right now. But the problem is, if you wait until it explodes, you're paying too much for it, far too much money for it. So it becomes unaffordable. So the object is to buy it now. Too many people buy on a high and sell on a low. The object is to buy on a low and sell on a high. And there's an opportunity now like there has never been before to take advantage of this. Happened 1971, right through to 1980, happened again 2007-8 through 2011, happening again now. And a lot of people sit back and say, wow, I wished I'd have done that. But there's no good wishing. One has to make a decision and recognise the position we're in right now. And I guess it gets back to Jim Sinclair, what Jim Sinclair has always said. Do what the central banks of the world do. That is, other than the Australian Central Bank. Do as the rest of them do, and buy gold.
Buy gold.
Protect your wealth.
Yeah.
And as Egon von Greyerz would say, and we have enormous respect for Egon, upon being asked the question, how much should I invest in precious metals? His answer is simple. You invest whatever you can't afford to lose. So having said that, John, I'd like to thank you so much for your input again today. Beautifully researched as usual, and our reliance on you for your input is massive and always appreciated. Also, to our viewers and subscribers, we thank you so much for continuing to support this channel, and keep doing so, and we'll keep on providing you with really great information. Thank you so much again, and what I'd like to say now to our viewers and our subscribers, stay well, stay focused, and goodbye for now.
And goodbye for now.